Hi, I'm Jennifer Jill Araya.
And I'm Sarah Beth Goer.
Welcome to the Crafting Audiobooks podcast, where we discuss the art and craft of audiobooks, and we aim to go deep quick.
Welcome, everybody. Our guest today is actor and narrator January LaVoy. January, we are so delighted to have you here. We're going to dive right into questions. What is something specific you've learned about your craft over time that has a big impact in your day-to-day work?
The thing I think that has the most impact, and this is going to sound like a plug, but it's not, but it's okay if it sounds like one. I'm doing an X session at VO Atlanta in a couple of weeks about this thing because I think it's one of the most important things. There is no such thing as how a narrator is supposed to sound. And I think it's so hard for people to wrap their mind around that because we've all, particularly those of us who grew up in the 20th century, there certainly was a voice of authority. There was a specific sound. You know, I'm from Connecticut, the Connecticut School of Broadcasting, NPR, whatever it was. There was this common sound that was considered the right way to speak, right? Broadcast, books, radio, whatever. And I find for myself, and I find when I teach, that the more real I can sound, and by real, I mean organic, authentically me, the more I can sound like I sound when I'm telling a story at a party, which is engaging and, you know, kind of all over the place, right? And you're doing other people's voices and you're telling it and you're waiting for, you know, laughs and all of these things are happening. I think the best narration lives in that realm. The best storytelling lives in that realm, not in some sort of, you know, staid, practiced, narrow lane of I can't go outside this. Oh, I can't. That sounded too gravelly, or did you hear me breathe there? You know, I hope we're all past trying to replicate that kind of sound. And importantly, it's what we can do that AI can't. I don't know if that's a conversation we're going to have here in the coming minutes.
You absolutely can have that conversation.
If we don't want to put ourselves out of a job, we need to be human, right? We talk about the human voice and AI voice. Well, guess what? What makes us human is all those different crags and qualities and the knowledge of what embarrassment feels like. So when I say that a character felt embarrassed, ooh, you know, and you get that is something, you know, at least not yet. The AI can't do that. So if we want to keep ourselves working, I think it's really important that we invest in our natural, organic, personal sound. So that's what I think about. And it took me a long time to get there.
Why do you think it took you a long time to get there? What do you think was keeping you from finding that?
Just that, you know, there, like I said, as somebody who grew up in the 20th century, there is a voice of authority in my mind. There's a right way to speak, a right way to pronounce things, a right way to talk, a right way to sound. And that has so many different factors. There's, you know, economic, social, racial, all kinds of things that, you know, when we talk about code switching and people trying to sound a certain way for a certain environment, well, I don't think any freelance performer who depends on, you know, people wanting to consume their work can claim to be completely disinterested in how people feel about what they do in a capitalist society. So, you know, there was a little nagging voice in the back of my head for a long time. Like, is it good enough? Do I sound good enough? And when I say that out loud right now, I'm like, I don't even know what that means. What does that even mean? Do I sound good enough? Right? Will the publishers think I sound good enough? Will they hire me again? All those little thoughts and voices in your head. So I think that, you know, just sort of certainly meeting with successes helps to alleviate those thoughts, but not completely. You know, I think there's just something about when I realized that I could get in a zone of telling a story in a way that felt good to me, that delighted me, that felt comfortable in my body, that's my best work. And that word best in that context has nothing to do with what anyone else thinks. It has to do with what I feel. So trying to balance those things where, of course, it's our job to serve the text, serve the story, the author's intention. That's our job. We do have to do that. We can't just like take it and do whatever we want with it. So to find that balance between my own personal comfort and feeling of authenticity and serving the piece, that takes some time.
I'm just so excited by what you're saying, because it seems to me that what you're describing is what artists are here on the planet to do, is to be our full selves courageously, to help give permission to other people to be themselves. And it also strikes me that what you are describing is a very powerful anti-racist and anti-sexist approach to art as well. So I'm just sitting here being very moved and delighted, and how yummy.
Well, thank you. I'd like to think that, the ways in which, when I was a young actor, undergrad and grad school, we were always taught, you find the universal in the specific, right? You're trying to be all things to all people, or trying to make the right choice that will appeal to lots of people leads you into generality. And it's the depth of specificity of choice that makes it universal, because you cannot experience or illustrate the thing everyone else is experiencing or wants to see illustrated. But what you can do is reveal the specificity of your own truth. And then that sort of rings that little truth bell inside all the other humans who are hearing you do that thing. That's where the universality comes from. So yeah, I think it is, by its very nature, sort of anti all of those things, because it just takes into consideration the human condition and human emotion. And at our best, I think that's what we're trying to get at with the art stuff.
Absolutely. I want to go back a little bit, January, and touch on something that you mentioned earlier about when you feel like you're really being your most authentic self as you're recording, that it feels good in your body. So I would love for you to describe, when you are recording, what you're focusing on and aware of. I mean, what are you noticing? Are you thinking about the world of the book, the world that you're creating? How does your focus change about, whether you're looking at dialogue or narration? Where is your mind as you're recording?
Yeah, so it's very much a movie in my mind. So the sort of, I'll say two different things here. So the sort of feeling that I feel, the space I like to put myself in or occupy in my own body, I've described before as, it's like you're on a road trip, but you're in the back seat of the car, right? And there's somebody else in the back seat with you, and you're on the highway, and you're going to be driving. It's night, and you're going to be driving for a really long time, and you're telling a story, but it's only for the person sitting next to you. You don't necessarily want the people in the front seat to hear you. So it's got this intimacy, but also this relaxation. Like, we're not going anywhere. I got time to tell you this story. It's a long story, but it's a good story, right? So that's how I kind of think about my environment, sort of trick myself into being like, I'm not in a studio where I can't make the temperature perfect and can't always breathe the way I want to. I'm in a place where this is a delightful thing, and I've got all day and all night, But then in terms of sort of what I visualize of the story as I'm going, it's very much a movie. I see, I've only recently kind of realized this. I sort of see camera 1, camera 2, camera 3, which is how I tend to think about switching character voices or character to narrator. And I also am extremely localized in terms of characters and where they live in my body. Different parts of my face. I'm wondering if this is making me sound like a weirdo as I'm saying it, but like some characters, like that one lives in my right nostril, and that's just where she is. And if I just think of her being in my right nostril, it sort of changes my whole face and my bearing, and I can feel my throat close a little bit to make that tighter sound, but I'm not really thinking about that. I'm thinking about my nostril, or I'm thinking about the eyebrow, or, don't we love it when an author gives us the gift of the word jowly, and we can sort of just like let everything on our face kind of, so yeah, they're in me, they're around me. It's this wonderful experience of kind of being completely immersed in the story, but also being able to pull back and see it at the same time.
Oh, how cool. That's a great thing to think about in the booth. It really is.
Yeah, I dig it.
When you are thinking about the author's intent, either as you're prepping or as you're reading, author's intent is frequently cited as one of the most important aspects of narration. And what is it in the text that helps you determine the author's intent?
So I think author's intent is a really good question, because authors don't always know what they're writing.
That is so true.
Right? Or what they even intend, or what they've achieved that might be different from what they intended. I can't tell you the number of times, especially with like sci-fi fantasy, I'm sure you've probably experienced this, where you'll be in touch with an author and you'll be like, and how is this made up word pronounced? And they're like, I never thought about how it would be pronounced. I liked the way it looked. Like they, in their mind, when they were writing, they didn't create an oral version, a spoken version of that word, right? So they don't know that they didn't do that, so, and that's a small kind of technical example, but, it's also like when I'm working on stage as an actor, there's no guarantee that my intention is going to be the thing that is received. Right. So I just have to go forward with my best, most well-investigated intention and trust that whatever the audience receives is what they're ready to receive, what they're primed to receive, what their emotional experiences and journeys are allowing them to receive. So in terms of how I think about the author's intention, this goes to my prep. I try to read the book as a consumer. I try to read the book as someone who chose the book, not that the book was given to me and now I have to do this sort of very forensic excavation of it. Although I do, at some point do that, pronunciations and dialects and pacing and all that kind of stuff. But initially, I just try to approach the book as someone who is reading it for pleasure, because that, I think, gets me closest to what's useful about the author's intention, because the author's intention is to reach the reader on like the most basic level. And so, I just did this awesome Nora Roberts book a couple weeks ago, and it's so fun. She's such a great writer, and it's so fun to go on that journey as a fan. And when I'm reading the book and thinking, the moment where I'm shocked or I'm nervous for the character or my breath catches, or I'm like, oh, that's how I felt about my boyfriend in high school or whatever, those are the moments that I key in on in terms of the author's intent, because I think that is the author speaking to me, both as the consumer of the book, but also as the narrator, to be like, this is important. This is doing a thing to me. And so I want to make sure when I'm then in the chair that I'm not getting in the way. Whatever I do or add or infuse as the narrator is not going to get in the way of the consumer having that experience. So that's really important to me. And that's sort of how I think about being a bridge, right, between the author's intent and the listener's experience.
Oh, that is such a great mindset to think about when we're prepping. I mean, so often when we're prepping, all we're focused on is that forensic aspect that you mentioned, but really approaching it the way that a consumer would. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I have one last question that actually all of us are going to answer. And January, we would love to have you go first. I want to know, Sarah and I both want to know, what is exciting to you about the craft of audiobooks right now, today? Like, what are you super digging about being an audiobook narrator right now?
This kind of goes back to something I mentioned earlier, but this whole thing with AI and what it's going to mean and what it's going to do. I do not have a crystal ball. And I would be lying if I said that I was super sanguine about like all of us being able to keep our jobs and careers and the way we pay our rent and mortgage. But it really has forced me to think about what I can do that a machine can't do. And I've never thought about art in that way. But I think we've reached a point in society where it's becoming actually critical to answer that question. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but narrating an audiobook is not saying the words on the page. It's not knowing how to pronounce. It's not text to speech, right? And they may be able to replicate a sound, but they cannot replicate or duplicate or graft our lived experience onto a sound. The pain I feel in my heart when I'm narrating a scene about loss is not something, at least in this life so far, that a machine can grasp. It can't be imitated. It can't be manufactured. I remember, this is a weird story maybe to bring up, but I played Mrs. Cratchit in A Christmas Carol at the McCarter Theater in Princeton for a number of years. And, there's the scene where Tiny Tim has died and it's Christmas future and we're all crying. And I had 4 children in the scene, 4 Cratchit kids, ages like 11 to 6. And every night, the little pallet that the Cratchit house was on would get pushed on stage and the scene would start and I would be crying, sewing and crying. And the kids one time asked me, like, how are you able to cry like that? And I said, well, when you've lived long enough, it's not hard to cry. And I didn't mean that in sort of a fatalistic way. I was just trying to answer the question. So I guess that's what I would say to AI. I'm sorry, AI, but when you've lived long enough, it's not hard to cry, but like that's that, right? Like that's the space we're talking about. And I want a healthy, vigorous, rigorous, honest conversation in our community about what this means and what it doesn't mean. Because I think it's really easy to be overtaken by, fear and things that are tossed off on social media or thoughts that, people have that are based in the fear of losing something that's very precious to all of us. But I think we are our own best advocates in this space. And it requires that we think really hard about what we do and why we love it and why it's important that we're the ones who keep doing it. There's a lot going on right now, and it's like, I have the same fear reaction that everybody else has in the first moment. And then it's just like, okay. If theater is still here after 4,000 years and everybody's saying that theater is dying every 200 years, we're going to be okay. But, we have to know our why, and so we just need to think more about our why, and we need to talk about it, and we need to lift each other up and remind everyone else of our why. So,
yeah, what humanity brings to the art of audiobooks is not something that AI has the capacity to do.
That's what I believe.
Wow, I love that. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sarah, what about you? What is thrilling you about the craft of audiobooks today?
Well, I'm a little hesitant to follow this, profound and meaningful conversation about like humanity and what humanity brings to art with like, my little, but I shouldn't diminish this little point I'm going to bring up, because the whole reason that you and I, or a major reason you and I started this podcast, is to celebrate what humans can do. And so this little thing I'm about to talk about is just a tiny little technical detail, but it's one that like matters and brings a paragraph to life on a more instinctual gut level that can't be replicated by a machine. So with that context, what I was excited to share today is I'm chewing on how the point of view of a character is what brings the character to life. So I was working on a piece and this one paragraph kind of fell flat. And it was a paragraph where my character was describing a room. And I was like, okay, why'd it go clunk? What's happening here? And I realized, all right, out of all the infinite things my character could describe, and out of all the infinite ways my character could describe it, my character is describing this room in this way. Why? And as soon as I got clear on that answer, the paragraph came to life because the character came to life. So it was the same descriptive words, but through the character's point of view. That's where the human connection is.
Oh,
Absolutely.
that is so
Absolutely.
cool. That plays with the cinematography parallel that January was talking about earlier, that, where the character chooses to point that video camera and what they choose to frame in that scene reveals who they are.
Yeah. And I would also say it goes to human empathy, that like, you don't necessarily care about these words on this page. You're not the character, but the minute that you can, as you said, get the why, that's, someone else's why, our ability to understand someone else's why, that's empathy. Right. And again, something that as far as we know, the machines don't have empathy yet. If they did, Twitter would be a much better place.
Agreed. Agreed. Oh, I love it. Well, I will go and answer that question for myself now. And what I have been sort of chewing on these last few days is more. So I've been thinking a lot about that video camera, us as cinematographers of the audiobook, and that image, and, it just has been rolling around in my head a lot, but thinking about it in terms of how the listeners receive it. I've had some conversations with listeners for a couple of my audiobooks over the last little bit, and they have noticed things in the audiobook as they're listening to something that I've narrated that I didn't even hear or intend. And just kind of thinking about how, if I go see a movie with a bunch of friends, all of us will notice different things. Mm-hmm. So that cinematographer, like I was just talking about, is framing the scene for the people who are watching this movie. But as individuals, the final consumer notices different things within that frame. And that is part of what brings the art of audiobook alive, because every listener to an audiobook is going to hear things slightly differently. And that's part of also what makes audiobooks its own art form, separate from the print or the ebook, because it's what the author has chose to put in the frame, translated through what we as the narrators have chosen to put in the frame, and then translated again through the listener and what the listener notices in all of those frames. And just that interplay of how an audiobook becomes alive and is a different thing for each individual listener. And yeah, the conversations I've had with these couple listeners the last few days have just really brought that to my mind. I've been chewing on that a lot as I'm recording. What am I putting in the frame for my listeners right now?
I love that idea of the frame. That is really fabulous, because it's true that, and it's actually on some level, it's mechanical, right? Because depending on our biology, right, how your inner ear is formed, you literally hear different tones, different sounds, different richness. Some people don't like the sound of my voice, and that's okay. Like that's how we're all built differently. But there's so much richness in that concept of an audio frame. I'm definitely going to be thinking about that for a while. That's very cool.
Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Well, January, this has been an incredible conversation, and Sarah and I are just so thankful for you for choosing to spend your time with us and have these conversations. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It was delicious talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and best of luck. I'm really glad you both are doing this.
Yeah, we're excited about it too. Thanks so much, and have a good evening.
You too.
Thanks Thanks so much for listening to Crafting Audiobooks. We've been your hosts, Jennifer Jill Araya
and Sarah Beth Goer.
wishing you happy audiobook listening and/or crafting.
Bye for now.